G'day guys, on today's video we're going to show you how to replace the front wheel bearings on this 100 series Landcruiser IFS model. It's going to apply to the 1998 to 2006 year models and also the Lexus LX470. Today we're going to be using this terrain Tamer wheel bearing kit, the WBK6, which comes with your inner and outer wheel bearing kits and also a replacement hub gasket, star washer and oil seal. Just before we get started, we've chocked both of the back wheels of the car with some bricks just to make sure it can't move anywhere. There are quite a few tools that we need to do this job, so we've put a full list down in the description below. The first step is just going to be to crack our wheel nuts before we raise the car up, and in our case that's going to use a 19mm socket on an extension. Alright, we're up underneath the front of the car now, just behind the front wheel, and we're just going to be installing our 2-ton factory bottle jack on the chassis rail here. Now, we've had to place the bottle jack on top of two 3-inch blocks of wood in this case, just because this car is a bit higher than normal and we needed that extra clearance. Once that wheel's off the ground, we can install our jack stand under the chassis rail. And then we're just going to lower the car down onto the jack stand. Now we can undo all the wheel nuts and take the tyre off. The next step is to remove the brake caliper, which is held on by 2 bolts from the back side. To remove them, we're going to need a 17mm socket on a breaker bar and a couple of cable ties to hold that caliper out of the way. Looking from the back side of the disc now, we're going to be removing this 17mm bolt here and the other one down here. You will find that these are quite tight, so you may want to spray some penetrating fluid before you start to loosen the bolts. Once you've got them loose with the breaker bar, you can loosen them the rest of the way with a socket wrench. Once you've removed those 2 bolts, just put them off to the side because we're going to need them again later. Lift the caliper up off of the brake disc and we're just going to place it up behind the dust cover that sits behind the brake disc. Grab a couple of cable ties, we've connected them end on end for a bit of extra length, and we're going to loop them around the suspension up above and through the bolt hole that had that 17mm bolt. Just to secure the caliper out of the way. Just before we get started, we've laid out some newspaper because there's going to be lots of oils and greases dripping down. So take a flathead screwdriver and a hammer, and we're just going to gently wedge the existing dust cap off. Next, we're going to take a 14mm socket and we're going to undo the 6 nuts that hold the hub flange on. So just remove those 6 nuts and the plain washers behind them and place them off to the side. And then we're going to get started on trying to remove the cone washers that are still in there. So we're going to take some WD-40 or a penetrating fluid and we're just going to spray that on each of the cone washers just to try and loosen them up a bit. Next, we're going to take a brass hammer, and it's important that you use a brass one here because a steel hammer will damage the threads. So you just want to place your brass hammer on the end of the stud and hit it with a steel hammer, and we're just trying to loosen up each of those cone washers that are still inside the flange. You just want to use a combination of hitting it with the hammer and then tapping on the flange itself just until those cone washers start to jump out. And there we go, that one's just jumped out there. At this point you can grab some vice grips or similar and just grab onto that cone washer and pull it out. There we go. There we go. Once all those cone washers and nuts are removed, we're just going to put them off to the side and we're going to clean them before we put them back in. The last thing we need to remove before the hub will come off is the circlip here, just at the end of the axle. So we're going to take some circlip pliers and we're just going to open up that circlip and slide it off the end, like so. Hang on to that one because we're going to clean that up and put it back on later. Now you might want to have a few gentle taps on the edge of the hub with a brass hammer, just to free it up a little bit. And it should just pop off like that. There we go. You'll notice in this case that the old gasket has stayed on this side. Sometimes it'll stick to the hub when you remove it, but you just want to pull that off. And we're going to be replacing that with a new gasket. The next step is to remove the lock nuts which hold the bearings in. So there are two lock nuts separated by a star washer, which will have a tab bent either inwards or outwards. So we just need to flatten out that tab using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. So I can see in this case I've got a tab just here bent towards me. So we're just going to tap that out so that we can actually get the socket over the lock nut. Next, we're going to take a 54mm hub socket on a socket wrench and we're just going to use that to loosen the first of those two lock nuts. Then you can undo it by hand. Next, we need to remove the star washer. You may need to get a flathead screwdriver underneath it just to pull it forward. And this kit comes with a new one of those, so you can throw that away. Then we've got our second 54mm hub nut. And you want to keep both of those. We're going to be cleaning them up and reinstating them. Now we should be able to pull the whole brake disc and hub assembly off of the car. You'll find that when you do that, your outer wheel bearing will fall out and it will also have stuck to it this washer with a tab, which you need to keep because we're going to be reinstating that later. While the outer wheel bearing fell out just then, you'll find that the inner wheel bearing on the back side is still held in place by the oil seal. So now that the outer wheel bearing is gone, we're going to slide the brake disc back on and we're going to reinstate one of those two 54mm lock nuts. And we're just going to thread that on gently by hand. Then we're going to place one hand behind each side of the brake disc and we're going to pull with a nice even force towards us. And as we do that, that lock nut is going to push the bearing and the oil seal out the back side of the hub. Like so. And you can see there's your inner bearing and your oil seal behind it. So then you can just unscrew that lock nut and they'll both come off. The next step is just to clean up all of the parts that we've removed, so to get rid of all of the old grease. You're going to want lots of brake and part cleaner and lots of paper towel for this. When it comes to the hub and the brake disc assembly, we just want to remove as much of the grease from inside there as we can. We're going to take a couple of wood blocks when we flip the hub over, just to avoid resting it on the studs. And again, we just want to try and get rid of as much of that old grease as we can. Once you're satisfied that you've got all of the grease from outside of the hub and on the other components, we're just going to take a look at the mating surfaces on both the flange and on the other side of the hub, just to make sure there's no old gasket material stuck on. And a really good way of cleaning this up is you take a razor blade and you just carefully run it along that mating surface, and it'll just pick up any of the little bits of gasket that may still be stuck on. In this case though, the old gasket came away fairly cleanly. You want to do the same thing on the mating surface on the hub side. So again, we're going to run our razor blade around each of these little studs just to make sure there's no old gasket material stuck on. So now that we've cleaned all that up, the next step is to bang out the two old bearing races from inside the hub. In order to do that, we're going to need a steel drift and a hammer. Now this drift is basically just about a 1/4 inch or a 6mm steel rod. And we're going to place the drift onto the edges of the race, which are exposed by these little ledges here, and there are 4 of them for each of the 2 bearing races. So starting with this outside bearing race, I'm going to move around to each of the 4 ledges, trying to tap that bearing race out nice and evenly. You want to be really careful the angle that you hold that drift at. You don't want to hold it at too sharp of an angle because we want to make sure we're not scratching the inside of the hub. And as you do this, progressively moving around those 4 little ledges, that bearing race will start to come out. And there we go, it's fallen through. And now we're going to flip over the hub and do the same thing for the inner bearing race. Hold on to those bearing races that come out. We're going to clean them up and we're going to show you a cool little trick after this that's going to help you get the new bearings in. So for the inner bearing, it's a little bit harder to get to. It's a little bit further in, but we're looking at 4 ledges down the bottom there. And we're going to use the same process again. Using the hammer and the drift, we're just going to bang around each of those 4 ledges until we get the bearing race out. And there we go, that's the inner race out. And again, we're going to clean that up and put it off to the side because we're going to use that in the next step. Once the old races are out, give it one last little wipe inside to clean it up before we put the new races in. So we're going to install our new bearing races now. So just open up the bearing pack. You can keep the bearing itself in the bag for now and just grab the race out. Now there are a couple of different ways you can do this. We'll show you both today. The first way is to use a bearing and seal driver kit like this one, and you basically find the right driver and install it with this. The second method, which we'll show you to install the inner race, is take your old race and we've cut a slit into that race using an angle grinder or a hacksaw. And what that will allow is for it to be slightly smaller when it compresses. And we're actually going to use that to apply even pressure to the new race. So take your new race, you're going to pop it in with the wider side facing downward. So just to get that new bearing race started, I'm going to take a block of wood and I'm just going to try and apply even pressure around all the edges to make sure that that race goes in nice and level. And there we go. Once we've got it nice and level with the edge of the hub there, we're going to take our old bearing race where we cut the slit and we're going to place that over the new race and we're going to hit that in order to hit the new race down. In this case, rather than hitting directly onto the old bearing, I'm going to take my bearing driver and I'm going to place that on top of the old bearing just to give me a nice even pressure in the middle. And the way that you tell when you've finished is you'll hear the sound will change to a nice high-pitched metallic clanging when the bearing gets to the end of its seat. And there it is. And then you just want to pull the old bearing race out and we're done. Next is the outer bearing. Same thing again. We can leave the bearing itself in the bag for now and just take out the race. And this time we're going to show the other method of just directly using the bearing and seal driver tool. So again, placing the bearing race in with the fatter side down, You want to just make sure that you're tapping nice and central on the driver to make sure that it seats in correctly. So you want to start off really slowly. And once you can feel that it's going in level, you can start to hit it a bit harder. And there we go, there's that metallic clanging that tells us we're done. We're ready to start assembling our new wheel bearings now, but before we do, we're just going to clean up the spindle back on the car. And you want to get rid of all of the old grease off of here. It's not critical that you do this, but it's a good opportunity to clean up your dust cover as well. So we're going to pack our new bearings with grease now. You're going to need a tub of a wheel bearing grease. In this case, we've gone for a red lithium grease. We're going to start with the inner bearing, the larger one. And you want to first, with a nice clean set of gloves, take a big clump of grease onto one hand, like that. And we're going to take that new bearing, and we're basically going to start from the bottom end, which is the wider side. And we're basically going to force that grease through the new bearing until we start to see it come out of the top. So the motion is rolling down like that. And we're slowly going to make our way around the bearing as well. It's quite messy, but you can just see there that the grease is starting to come up through the bearing. So you want to keep going until that's happening all the way around the edge. So once you've got the bearing thoroughly packed with grease and it's coming up through the rollers all the way around, you just want to smear some around the edge as well. And then we're just going to drop that bearing in with the smaller side going in first. Any extra grease that you have on your hands, you can just rub that onto the inside of the hub. Then we're going to take our new oil seal. With the flat side facing upwards, we're going to place that down and in. Then take your seal driver tool and your hammer, and we're just going to tap that seal down until it's flush with the edge of the hub. Once that seal's in nice and flush, take a little bit of extra grease and we're just going to rub that around the edge of that seal. While we're here, just quickly clean up any excess grease that got on the brake disc or on the ABS speed sensor rotor. Now we're going to flip that over, and that oil seal will hold that inner bearing in place. Next, we're going to pack grease inside the hub, and you just want to pack it until the grease is level with the inside of the hub. Now we're going to repeat the process for the outer bearing. So again, just an up and down motion, pushing the grease up through the bearing. And there we can just see it starting to come out through the top of the rollers. Alright, so once that's thoroughly packed with grease, again, just make sure there's lots wiped around the outside of those rollers, and then we're going to drop that in with the smaller side facing downward. Now at this point, we're ready to put a clean pair of gloves on. Before we do, we can just wipe all of that excess grease on our hands onto the spindle. Alright, so now we're ready to lift the whole hub assembly back onto the spindle. And when you do this, just be careful not to push the outer bearing off, because it's just sitting in there. And like you saw just there, sometimes the outer bearing will just pop out, so just push it back in. Next, we're going to install the claw washer, which has this little tab on it, and you want to line up that tab with the groove in the spindle. In this case, it's on the right hand side. Then we want to take one of our two 54mm nuts and just thread that on by hand. We're going to torque up that nut using the 54mm hub socket and a torque wrench. And we're going to do it up to 43 foot-pounds, which is 59 Newton meters. Alright, so once that's tight, you want to hold the brake disc with one hand on each side and just spin it. And just make sure it's moving nice and freely. Then you want to back that nut right off until it's finger tight again. Then we're going to torque it back up to about 6 Newton meters. Next, we want to install our new lock washer, which again has a tab on the inside which lines up with the spline on the spindle. Then our second lock nut. And you want to torque this one up to 47 foot-pounds, which is 64 Newton meters. Again, we just want to check and feel that the bearing is seated correctly. While you're doing this, you just want to feel as well and make sure there's no ability for the disc to be moving forward and back. Now if you follow the Toyota workshop manual, it tells you to check the tension on the bearing with a spring gauge. We don't have one, but if you are going to check that preload with a spring gauge, the figure you're aiming for is 42 to 67 newtons. Once you're happy with how that bearing feels, we're ready to bend the tabs on the lock washer to hold the nuts in place. Taking a flathead screwdriver and a hammer, we're just going to bend some of these tabs inward and some outward. Once those lock washer tabs are all bent, we just want to clean up the flange face, ready to receive our new gasket. Now that that flange face is clear of any grease, we can place our new gasket on. And just make sure it seats evenly all the way around. Then take your flange, which you've cleaned up, and you just want to line up the 3 holes with the pins in the existing flange. There we go. And now we can take our 6 cone washers and nuts that we've cleaned up and put them back on. Then you can take a socket wrench with a 14mm socket, and we're just going to do them up to push those cone washers down. Once the cone washers are all seated inside the drive flange, we're going to torque up all of these nuts, and the torque spec for these is 24 foot-pounds or 33 Newton meters. Now we're ready to reinstate our circlip. Now depending on which kit you use, you may get a new one, but we've just cleaned up the one we removed earlier. So just using your circlip pliers, split the 2 edges and slide it over the end of the axle. Then you can just clean up any grease from the end of the axle and put your dust cap back on and just tap that into place using the brass or a rubber hammer. And that's done. Before we put the brake caliper back on, we're just going to take some brake and parts cleaner and some paper towel and just clean off any grease or grime that's on the brake disc itself. And just make sure you get the back side of the disc as well. We're finished with the hub now and we're ready to reinstate our brake caliper. So we're just going to cut those cable ties that we installed earlier. I'm going to rotate the brake caliper back around and seat it back onto the brake disc. Once that's in place, we're going to install our 2 17mm bolts from before. So start by just installing the bolts loosely by hand. And then we're going to take the torque wrench and do these ones up. Now these are quite tight. The torque spec is 91 foot-pounds, which is 123 Newton meters. It's a 17mm socket for these two bolts. And there we go. That's all there is to putting the brake caliper back on. Now we're ready to put the wheel back on. Then you can install your wheel nuts. So you just want to go around and make sure they're nipped up. We're going to fully tighten them once the car is back on the ground. So we're just going to raise the car a little bit now to the point where we can remove the jack stand. Once that jack stand's out of the way, we can slowly lower the jack until the wheel's back on the ground. And now we can just do the final tighten on each of our wheel nuts, moving in a crisscross pattern. So that's it guys, that's how you change your front wheel bearings on a 100 series Landcruiser or LX470. If there's anything you would have done differently or something you'd like to see next time, please let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.